All right, in this video, I'm going to talk about proper position for the lumbar spine and not substituting movement for the hip, as well as proper lumbopelvic posture. So that's a term I'm going to use, and it's going to be in your notes. And when I say neutral lumbopelvic position, so lumbar and pelvis, we're looking at a nice level waistline. What we don't want is this anterior pelvic tilt, so we really exaggerate that. Think of your pelvis as a bucket. So if my bucket is pretty full of water, I need to keep it level to prevent water from spilling out. As soon as I start to anteriorly rotate the pelvis, now I'm dumping water out of the front of the bucket. So a couple of things go on with that. One, you're going to cause some inhibition of your glutes. So we're rotating the pelvis forward, pulling all that up. You're not going to get to use your glutes quite as well. To me, more importantly, you're going to be crunching those facets. So the facets are where the vertebrae line up with the other vertebrae below it. And as we go into extension, which is what's happening when we go into this pelvic tilt, we're really starting to crunch those lumbar facets. And then if you're doing exercises where you're loading, and particularly when we do some kind of overhead position, letting your pelvis go forward is going to really dig into the back. And then it's not going to be helpful when you're out there running. We want to work on bringing the pelvis into a neutral position instead of this anterior pelvic tilt. So neutral lumbopelvic posture simply means your waistband on your shorts or your pants is going to be level, horizontal. Now, when I start thinking about lumbar substitution, so this is a pretty significant thing with most people, where we should be moving through the hip joint. So I'm thinking about hip flexion and hip extension. Hip flexion, hip extension. But what a lot of people tend to do is they substitute lumbar flexion and lumbar extension. So instead of moving through my hip joint, people are going to flex through the lumbar spine, and then they're going to extend through the lumbar spine. So I'm exaggerating it, but we'll see this pattern with runners as they're moving along. Instead of being very stable through the midsection, fairly neutral through the lumbopelvic position, and then moving through the hip joint. So when you're looking at exercises, things like maybe a knee drive, or even if you're doing things like an A-skip, the tendency may be to fold over, and we want to make sure we're nice and neutral and that movement is occurring through the hip joint. So whether it's flexing the hip or extending the hip, make sure you don't go into any lumbar substitution. So with this, we're keying in on lumbopelvic posture, which simply means a nice neutral alignment. And then we're not going to substitute by moving through the spine. And that's going to be across the board with pretty much everything we do. I don't want you moving between the ribs and hips. So you're going to keep that connected, make sure movement comes from the hip joint, and that way we don't abuse the back and end up beating it up in the long run.